Sure. So I really appreciate Serena just making it plain. Um, because another thing that when, as Asians and also non-Asians, right, when we are fighting anti-Asian racism, any form of racism, right, we need to make sure that we're not perpetuating anti-Blackness as we do it, because that is also a very prevalent problem, especially in the Asian communities, right? We're not a monolith. So not only are we facing different things like, immigrant experiences, or depending on what generation, your ethnic group, how long have they been in America? Because, like there were specific immigration exclusionary acts and laws that prevented, Asians from immigrating. And then when they did let them, it was the cream of the crop. You had to have a certain type of job. You had to have a certain type of education. You had to have a certain type of, you had to have money to, immigrate. And so the challenge is when we are also we are a interconnected and community-based culture, right? So we're communal, we're not very individualistic. And so when we see our elders brutalized, it's a very deep pain that I'm sure everybody understands, but I think for Asians and Asian Americans, the way we honor our elders is so ingrained in our culture. So when we see them brutalized and so helpless, there is this visceral reaction that we have, yet not knowing how to address it. Is there a language barrier between our generations? And then another factor is that, when elders are brutalized, how do they report it? There are, we have great, websites like Stop AAPI Hate, which is a website that you then log on to and report, an incident. Then we're talking about tech access, and the form is in English, or if it's, in another language. So we're dealing with our elders who really have ethnic identities and became racialized when they became immigrants to this, country. So, when I speak with my mother, she doesn't identify as Asian off the bat. She'll identify as a Korean woman, right? For me, having been born and raised here, I identify as Korean American. I'll identify as Korean, as Asian American. But Asian American in and of itself is a political term that, was coined in the 1960s with the Black Power movement as an act of solidarity. And so it's really important for us to learn history of how we are so interconnected. Activist Grace Lee Boggs, she's known for saying, the only way that we're going to survive is by taking care of each other, right? And so in order for us to do that, we need to know each other's history. Right. So, we're not playing the oppression Olympics. We're not perpetuating anti-Blackness. We're not saying, oh, it's, all, this type of people who are attacking us. It's really not. And if you're going to say that, you should really base it on facts. So I think a University of Michigan study revealed that in 2020, 90% of the reported anti-Asian hate crimes were perpetuated by white people, 90%, and only 5% were by Black perpetrators. But on the media and mainstream media, what do you see? Perpetually, we see Black perpetrators. Now, you could argue that, was it because that was what was caught on camera, or, is mass media, having a certain agenda? We don't have the facts, but what we can do is equip ourselves with education. So education includes history. So, PBS, I think they still have it for free, has a great, 5-part documentary, Asian Americans. It's not exhaustive, right? But it's a start. And it also includes not just East Asians, right? South Asians, Southeast Asians. It could definitely include more. I think they should make a part 2, honestly. So, or reading books like historians like Erica Lee or Dr. Jane Hong. There's so many, Asian historians out there who can really break down just resources for Asian Americans. There's a group, I think it's called the Asian American Project, or Asian American Education Project. You might have to Google them. They're trying to provide resources for K-12 education. So ethnic studies often happens in, higher education, and that's how I, took my first Asian American studies course. But it really should be at the K-12 level. So, they're making resources available, following media outlets that are not necessarily mass media. So Next Shark, Asian Feed, these are kind of social media pages, or if they started out as social media pages, NBC Asian America. So making sure that you're getting Asian American news by Asian Americans, right? Not filtered through a white lens, not filtered through a lens that is not our own. That includes maybe speaking with news outlets that are in native tongues, right? And so translation always becomes, an issue. So one way that people can invest really is in their education, right? Learning, unlearning, relearning, right? Making sure that we're moving towards solidarity and not like repeated history of where we're pitting communities of color against each other, because that's how, the racial caste system in America is built, right? So investing in organizations that will educate, right? I think, Hollaback, great bystander training program. They're partnered with AJC. API Women Lead is another great organization. There's so many, and once you start following these organizations, you start to get linked and introduced to other organizations. And so you want to invest also in local, networks and people who've been on the ground doing the work. Like Safe Walks is a new one, but there are local organizations all across the country that have been doing the work. So making sure, we're investing in those, investing in communities by maybe if they have something available in English, saying, I can provide the funds for you to get a translator to translate these resources into different Asian languages, right? That's one practical way to reach out to an organization. I think what was difficult for me personally when the Atlanta massacre happened was, you're dealing with the trauma of what the horror that it was, but also as an Asian American woman, the fetishization, the hypersexualization, you're dealing with all of this trauma, triggering previous trauma. And then I had a bunch of people reaching out and very well-intentioned, but let me know if I could do anything for you. Let me know what you need, right? And I think part of it is culturally, we're not as used to being like, hey, can you do this for me? Right? It's not really ingrained in our culture. And also that also takes the mental energy to like think about, okay, what are my needs and what can I tell you? What do I feel comfortable telling you? Whereas I had people just reaching out, specifically Black women who know, misogynoir, who know the deep pain of racial trauma and sexual trauma and all of that, who either just sent me food, Venmoed me and say, hey, I'm taking care of your basic needs right now, without saying, hey, like, how are you, without putting the pressure on me to respond. And not that I'm not grateful for all those who, reached out and said, hey, can you do that? Or, hey, what do you need? But sometimes if you could think ahead and say, you know what, you probably don't have the bandwidth to tell me what you need, so I'm just gonna send you something to take care of your basic needs. That is one way that you could do interpersonal care. But in terms of systemic, I think education will lead us to liberation. Our solidarity has to be across communities of color, so that we don't repeat history, right? I think about, right now it's April 28th, tomorrow is April 29th, I think, of the LA uprisings. And oftentimes we say that as Asian Americans, oh, it's not part of our culture to speak up. We're literally, most of our home countries have come to where they are because of their own cultural, like their own uprisings, rebellions. And so to say that it's not part of our culture, I think partially, yes, it's true, but that's to discredit our ancestors, our kin who are still there. There are uprisings still happening, Hong Kong, Myanmar. Like, we need to know that we are not invisible, but we have been erased. And to counter that, we need to be able to learn our history and be like, this is my history, this is how I'm going to create my future.